Montana Territory, 1886. The sunset painted the western horizon in broad strokes of amber and crimson as Jake Cooper removed his hat and wiped sweat from his brow. At 24, he was considered young for a trail boss, but 3 years of successful cattle drives had earned him that title. Still, as he gazed across the sprawling herd of 2,000 longhorns stretching across the grassland, doubt gnawed at him like a persistent wolf. First drive as boss, eh? The voice startled Jake from his thoughts. He turned to see a wizened face, weathered like old saddle leather. Elijah Thornton sat atop a paint horse that looked almost as ancient as its rider. At 95 years old, Elijah was a living legend, a man who had been driving cattle since before Jake's father was born. Yes, sir, Jake nodded, running a hand through his thick chestnut hair. Taking these beasts all the way to Cheyenne. Elijah's eyes, remarkably clear despite his age, studied the younger man. You're Caleb Cooper's boy, ain't you? I am, Jake replied, suddenly standing straighter. His father had been respected among cattlemen throughout the territory. Good man, your pa taught you the trade, did he? Jake's jaw tightened. Some. Died when I was 16. Elijah nodded slowly. So young to lose a father. And now here you are, barely grown yourself, leading men twice your age. The comment stung, though Jake knew Elijah hadn't meant it as an insult. It was the truth. Most of the 12 cowboys under his charge had been herding cattle longer than he'd been alive. Why had the ranch owner, Mr. Hollister, trusted him with this responsibility? The question had haunted Jake for weeks. Well, Elijah continued, reckon I'll be riding along, if you'll have me. He gestured toward the chuck wagon. Your cook offered me passage to Cheyenne. Said I might earn my keep offering advice. Jake hesitated. The last thing he needed was an ancient cowboy slowing them down or, worse, questioning his authority in front of the men. But refusing would be disrespectful. We'd be honored, Mr. Thornton, he said finally, hoping his voice conveyed more certainty than he felt. Elijah's weathered face cracked into a smile. Call me Elijah, son. We've got a long trail ahead. That night, as the crew gathered around the campfire, Jake noticed how the men gravitated toward Elijah, listening to his tales of cattle drives before the war, of rustlers and renegades, of crossing rivers swollen by spring floods. Jake sat apart, studying the maps spread across his knees, planning tomorrow's route. You planning on sleeping tonight, boss? Asked Sam, the grizzled trail cook. After I figure out where we're crossing the Little Missouri, Jake answered, not looking up. Sam chuckled. Seems to me there's a man over yonder who's crossed that river 100 times. Might save you some thinking. Jake glanced toward Elijah, who was demonstrating some rope trick to the delighted cowboys. I know my job, Sam. Never said you didn't. Just saying 2 heads are better than 1, especially when one's seen near a century of living. Jake folded his map with more force than necessary. I'll keep that in mind. 2 days later, as they approached the river, Jake realized his planned crossing point was impassable. Spring rains had turned the ford into a churning death trap. Problem, boss. Elijah appeared beside him, his voice carrying no hint of judgment. Jake swallowed his pride. River's too high. Need to find another crossing. Elijah nodded thoughtfully. About 3 miles north, there's a place where the river widens. Gets shallow over a gravel bed. Used it many times. That would add a day to our journey, Jake protested. Better a day late than dead cattle and cowboys washing up in Dakota Territory, Elijah replied mildly. Jake stared at the old man, then nodded once. Lead the way. The crossing proved exactly as Elijah described, and they lost not a single cow. That evening, Jake approached Elijah's bedroll. Thank you, he said simply. Elijah looked up, his eyes twinkling in the firelight. First lesson of the trail, son, a good leader knows when to listen. What's the second lesson? Jake asked, surprising himself with his eagerness. Elijah laughed. We've got 1,000 miles ahead. Plenty of time for lessons. The next morning, as they broke camp, a rider approached from the east. She rode astride, not side saddle, her dark blue riding skirt draped gracefully over her mare. Her honey blonde hair was partially visible beneath a practical wide-brimmed hat, and she guided her horse with the confidence of someone born to the saddle. That's Miss Joanna Ryder, whispered one of the cowboys to Jake. Old man Hollister's niece. Jake felt his stomach tighten. He'd never met the ranch owner's niece, but he'd heard stories about her education back east, her headstrong nature, What was she doing here, hundreds of miles from the ranch? As she approached, Jake was struck by her beauty, not the delicate, porcelain beauty of Eastern ladies he'd glimpsed in town, but something wilder, more vibrant. Her skin was sun-kissed, her blue eyes direct and unafraid. "Miss Ryder," he said, removing his hat. "I'm Jake Cooper, trail boss. This is unexpected." "Mr. Cooper." She nodded, her voice clearer and stronger than he'd anticipated. "Uncle sent me. There's been a change of plans." Jake felt 11 pairs of eyes on his back, waiting. "What sort of change?" "You're to take the herd to Helena instead of Cheyenne. There's a new buyer offering 30% more." Jake frowned. "Helena's 100 miles northwest of our route. Through rough country. Uncle said you'd figure it out." She dismounted in one fluid motion. "I'll be accompanying you." Jake blinked. "Ma'am, this is no place for a what, Mr. Cooper?" Her eyes narrowed dangerously. "A woman? I've been working cattle since I was 12. Uncle sent me not just with the message, but to make sure his interests are represented." Jake glanced back at his men, who quickly busied themselves with their tasks, though he could see smiles tugging at their lips. "Miss Ryder, the trail is dangerous, uncomfortable, and nothing I haven't experienced before," she interrupted, her chin lifting. "I brought my own gear and can pull my weight. Now, shall we discuss the new route, or would you prefer to waste more time trying to send me home?" From behind them came the sound of Elijah's wheezing laughter. "Lord Almighty, she reminds me of my Martha. Stubborn as a Missouri mule and twice as smart." Joanna turned, noticing the old man for the first time. "And you are?" "Elijah Thornton, miss. Been pushing cattle since before statehood." Her eyes widened. "The Elijah Thornton? Who drove the first herd up from Texas after the war?" Elijah grinned, tipping his hat. "The very same, though I was already an old man then." "My father spoke of you often," she said, genuine admiration in her voice. "He said you knew more about cattle than any man alive." "Your father being?" "Thomas Ryder." Elijah's face lit up. "Tommy Ryder. Now there was a cowhand. Rode with him in '58. Fine man." He turned to Jake. "You'd be wise to keep this one close, boss. Riders have good trail sense." Jake felt outmaneuvered, but knew when to retreat. "We'll adjust our course after breakfast. You can ride scout with Martinez if you're determined to stay." "I am," she said simply. As she walked toward the chuck wagon, Elijah leaned closer to Jake. "Second lesson of the trail, son, the most valuable asset isn't the cattle, it's the people riding with you." Jake watched Joanna greet the other men with easy familiarity. She clearly knew her way around cowboys and cattle, but her presence complicated everything. He had a job to do, a herd to deliver, men to lead. He didn't need distractions, especially not beautiful, strong-willed distractions with eyes like the Montana sky. What he didn't know was that Joanna carried secrets of her own, secrets that would soon threaten not just the cattle drive, but their very lives. The first week on the altered trail passed without major incident, though Jake noticed the growing tension among some of the men. The change in destination meant riding through territory known for hostile tribes and ruthless outlaws. 3 of the cowboys had approached him privately, expressing concerns about the wisdom of the new route. Jake shared their worries, but kept his doubts to himself. A leader couldn't show uncertainty, especially not a young one. Instead, he focused on pushing the herd forward, maintaining a grueling pace that left little time for conversation, or for dwelling on the growing awareness he felt whenever Joanna rode near. She had proven herself capable beyond question. She rose before dawn each day, saddled her own horse, and took whatever duties he assigned without complaint. More than once, her quick reaction had prevented steers from straying or spotted potential danger ahead. The men had accepted her readily enough, treating her with a rough respect. It was during the second week, as they made camp near a narrow stream cutting through a pine-forested valley, that Jake finally found himself alone with Joanna. He had climbed a ridge to survey the next day's route when he heard the sound of hooves. Turning, he saw her approaching, silhouetted against the setting sun. "Your men think you're avoiding me," she said without preamble as she dismounted. Jake kept his expression neutral. "I've been busy. Too busy to discuss our route with me? I know this country better than you do, Mr. Cooper." "Jake," he corrected automatically. "Jake," she repeated, and something in the way she said his name made his chest tighten. "Why won't you let me help you?" He turned back to the landscape before them. the rolling hills giving way to more rugged terrain in the distance. "I know my job, Miss Ryder." "Joanna," she countered, moving to stand beside him. "And I never suggested otherwise. But this isn't the route my uncle would have chosen." He frowned. "What do you mean? You're the one who brought the message to change course." She hesitated, and for the first time, he saw uncertainty in her eyes. "Yes, but there's something not right. The buyer and Helena. Uncle didn't mention a name, which isn't like him. And the price seems too good. Are you saying the message was false?" Jake felt a cold knot form in his stomach. "No, it came from him. But I can't shake the feeling." She trailed off, gazing at the distant mountains. "What feeling?" She turned to face him fully. "That my uncle was forced to send it. That someone might be setting a trap." Jake studied her face, noting the genuine concern in her eyes. "Do you have any proof?" "No. Just instinct." He wanted to dismiss her fears. Women's intuition, nothing more. But something in her steady gaze stopped him. "Why are you telling me this now?" "We're halfway to Helena." "Because I've been watching the men. Hardy and Wilson have been talking privately, more than seems natural. And 3 nights ago, I saw Wilson ride out after dark. He returned before dawn." Jake frowned. He trusted his crew, had worked with most of them before. Maybe he couldn't sleep. Needed some space. "Maybe," she acknowledged. "But combined with everything else. I thought you should know." He nodded slowly. "I'll keep an eye out." "Thank you." They stood in silence for a moment, the distance between them both physical and something more. Then she said, "You're doing well, you know. The men respect you." The unexpected compliment caught him off guard. "They're good cowboys. Makes my job easier." "That's not what I meant," she said softly. "Leading men isn't just about knowing cattle and trails. It's about earning trust. They trust you." Before he could respond, a shout came from below. They both turned to see one of the cowboys, Martinez, racing toward camp. "Riders coming," he yelled. "At least a dozen." Jake and Joanna exchanged a quick glance before rushing to their horses. As they rode back toward camp, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that Joanna's instincts might be right, and that the danger she'd sensed had just arrived. The approaching riders weren't hostile, as it turned out, but a cavalry patrol from Fort Keogh. The lieutenant in charge, a serious young man named Phillips, requested a word with Jake away from the others. "We've had reports of rustlers operating in this region," Phillips explained once they were out of earshot. "Large gang, well organized. They've hit 3 drives in the past month." Jake felt his shoulders tense. "Any pattern to their attacks?" "They seem to have inside information. They strike at night, usually when the herd is crossing difficult terrain." Phillips lowered his voice. "And there's evidence they've been infiltrating drive crews beforehand." Jake thought immediately of Joanna's suspicions about Wilson. "I appreciate the warning, Lieutenant. We'll be patrolling the area, but we're stretched thin. Just be vigilant." Phillips hesitated. Strange to see a woman on a cattle drive. "Miss Ryder represents the owner's interests," Jake replied stiffly. The lieutenant nodded. "Just keep her safe. These rustlers aren't known for gentlemanly behavior." After the patrol departed, Jake gathered his most trusted men, Martinez, old Sam the cook, and his right-hand man, Lyle, along with Joanna and Elijah. He shared the lieutenant's warning and Joanna's concerns about Wilson. "I've known Wilson 3 years," Lyle objected. "He's solid." "Maybe so," Jake conceded, "but we need to be careful. From now on, double night watch. No one rides alone." He turned to Joanna. "Including you." She nodded, her expression grim. "If there is a traitor among us, they'll be watching for changes in routine." "That's why we won't have any," Jake decided. "We continue as normal, but alert." Elijah, who had been silent throughout the discussion, finally spoke. "Third lesson of the trail. Sometimes the greatest danger comes from within." That night, Jake couldn't sleep. He walked the perimeter of the camp, checking on the night guards, his hand never far from his revolver. As he approached the chuck wagon, he was surprised to find Joanna sitting alone, staring into the dying embers of the fire. "You should be resting," he said softly. She looked up, unsurprised by his presence. "So should you." He sat beside her, keeping a respectful distance. "Difficult to sleep with so much on my mind. The potential traitor? That and—" He paused, searching for words. "Why would your uncle send you into danger? If he suspected something was wrong, why involve you?" She smiled faintly. "I volunteered. Uncle didn't want me to come, but I insisted. He's the only family I have left. Jake nodded, understanding family loyalty all too well. Still, it's a heavy risk. Life is risk, Jake Cooper, she said, her voice soft in the night air. Especially out here. Something in her tone made him turn to study her profile, delicate yet strong in the faint glow of the embers. What brought you west, Joanna? You're educated, refined. You could have had a comfortable life back east. She was quiet for so long he thought she might not answer. Finally, she said, freedom. After my parents died, influenza, 5 years ago, I went to live with my mother's sister in Boston. She was determined to mold me into a proper society lady. Her lips curved into a small smile. It didn't take. So you came to your uncle. He understood me. Never tried to change me. She looked directly at him then. What about you? What drives Jake Cooper? He considered deflecting the question, but found himself wanting to share with her. Proving myself, I suppose. My father was respected, but he wasn't warm. Praise came rarely. After he died, I promised myself I'd build something he would have been proud of. And this drive is part of that. It's everything, he admitted. If I succeed, Hollister has promised me a partnership in his next venture. Land of my own, eventually. A worthy dream, she said, and he was struck by the absence of judgment in her voice. Their eyes held for a long moment, and Jake felt a pull toward her that had nothing to do with the dangers they faced. Before he could speak again, a sound from the darkness snapped their attention away from each other. Jake was on his feet instantly, gun drawn. Who's there? He called. Wilson emerged from the shadows, his hands raised slightly. Just me, boss. Coming off watch. Jake slowly lowered his weapon. You're early. Barton's not due to relieve you for another hour. Thought I heard something, Wilson explained, his eyes flicking briefly to Joanna. Came to report. Jake studied the man's face, looking for signs of deception. And nothing there. Must have been a coyote. Get some rest. Then, Jake ordered. You're on point tomorrow. Wilson nodded and disappeared toward his bedroll. When he was gone, Joanna whispered, he wasn't coming from the direction of his watch post. Jake's jaw tightened. I know. The next morning dawned gray and threatening, with dark clouds building in the west. Jake called for an early start, hoping to make significant progress before the storm hit. As the crew prepared to move out, he kept Wilson in his sights, noting how the man spoke quietly with Hardy near the remuda. Elijah rode up alongside Jake. Storm's going to be a bad one. Jake nodded. We'll push hard until midday, then find shelter if it looks to break. The old man's eyes followed Jake's gaze toward Wilson. Made up your mind about him yet? No, Jake admitted. But I'm watching. Good, Elijah said. Trust is earned, not given. But remember, a suspicious mind sees enemies everywhere. Speaking from experience? Elijah's weathered face creased into a smile. I've made my share of mistakes, son. Trusted those I shouldn't, doubted those I should have believed in. His eyes drifted toward Joanna, who was helping secure the chuck wagon. That one, though, she's true as steel. Jake followed his gaze. You seem certain. I knew her father. Thomas Ryder had no guile in him, and the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Elijah adjusted his hat against the rising wind. Fourth lesson of the trail. Judge people by their actions, not your fears. By midday, the storm was upon them. Rain fell in blinding sheets, and lightning split the sky with jagged fury. The cattle grew restless, bunching together against the elements. Jake had managed to find a sheltered valley, but the driving rain was still making the ground treacherous. We need to hold them here, he shouted to Martinez over the howling wind. They bolt in this, we'll lose half the herd. Martinez nodded grimly and rode off to position men around the increasingly agitated Longhorns. Jake searched the rain-blurred landscape for Joanna, finally spotting her helping Sam secure the chuck wagon against the gale. Relief flooded through him, followed immediately by concern as he realized Wilson was nowhere in sight. Jake spurred his horse toward Lyle, who was struggling with a frightened steer. Have you seen Wilson? Sent him south with Hardy to check the rear guard. Lyle shouted back. A terrible suspicion formed in Jake's mind. I didn't authorize that. Who told them to go? Confusion crossed Lyle's face. Wilson said you wanted the rear checked. Said you were worried about stragglers. Jake cursed and wheeled his horse around. Get everyone to the herd. Now, he galloped through the downpour toward the chuck wagon. Joanna, he called as he approached. Wilson and Hardy are missing. Her head snapped up, alarm clear in her eyes despite the rain streaming down her face. "The storm," she said, understanding immediately. "Perfect cover for." Her words were cut off by a sound that chilled Jake's blood. Gunshots, barely audible over the storm, followed by the distant but unmistakable rumble of panicked cattle. "Stampede," he yelled. "They've spooked the rear guard." What happened next was chaos. The main herd, already nervous from the storm, caught the panic from their scattered brethren. 2,000 cattle suddenly surged forward as one mass, breaking through the line of cowboys trying to contain them. "Head for high ground," Jake shouted to anyone who could hear him. He saw Joanna still by the chuck wagon and raced toward her. "Come on," he yelled, extending his hand. She grabbed it without hesitation, swinging up behind him on his horse. They galloped toward a rocky outcropping as the ground shook with the force of the stampeding herd. From their vantage point, they watched helplessly as the cattle thundered past, followed by cowboys desperately trying to regain control. The chuck wagon had been overturned in the chaos, and several horses from the remuda had broken free, disappearing into the storm. "There," Joanna pointed through the rain. In the distance, barely visible, were riders, at least 8 of them, driving a split portion of the herd away from the main group. "The rustlers," Jake growled, "and I'd bet Wilson and Hardy are with them." As the last of the stampede passed their position, Jake noticed something that made his blood run cold. Elijah's paint horse was running riderless among the stragglers. "Elijah," he breathed, scanning the trampled ground below. He was on rear guard. Joanna tightened her grip around his waist. "We have to find him." They rode down from the outcropping, following the path of destruction left by the stampede. The rain was easing now, allowing better visibility. About a quarter-mile back, they spotted a still form lying beside a fallen tree. Jake was off his horse before it fully stopped, rushing to the old man's side. Elijah was conscious but badly injured, his breathing labored, a bloody gash across his forehead. "Knew something was wrong," he gasped as Jake gently examined him. "Wilson shot at me. Would have killed me if the stampede hadn't come when it did." "Don't talk," Jake urged, tearing a strip from his shirt to bind the old man's head wound. "We'll get you to safety." Elijah's hand clutched Jake's arm with surprising strength. "Listen to me, boy. They weren't just after cattle. Heard them talking before they saw me." "What did they say?" Joanna asked, kneeling beside them. "Something about papers in the chuck wagon." Elijah's eyes focused with effort. "And the girl? They want the girl." Jake and Joanna exchanged alarmed glances. "Me?" she whispered. "Why would they want me?" Elijah's grip weakened. "Don't know, but they're coming back tonight." As the storm finally broke and weak sunlight filtered through the clouds, Jake faced his most difficult challenge yet. Half the herd was scattered or stolen. The chuck wagon was destroyed, along with most of their supplies. Elijah needed medical attention, and now they knew the rustlers weren't done. They would return, seeking Joanna for reasons unknown. Worst of all, Jake had no idea whom among his remaining men he could truly trust. The following hours were a blur of activity. The cowboys who had stayed loyal, Martinez, Lyle, Sam, and 4 others, worked tirelessly to gather the scattered cattle. Jake sent the youngest, a boy named Tommy, riding hard for Fort Keogh with a message for Lieutenant Phillips. Elijah was made as comfortable as possible in a makeshift shelter, with Sam tending to his wounds. Jake kept Joanna close, unwilling to let her out of his sight after Elijah's warning. As dusk approached, they stood together on a rise overlooking their hastily established camp. "You should leave," he told her quietly. "Take my best horse and ride for the fort. I'll handle things here." She shook her head firmly. "I'm not running, Jake. This isn't about courage," he insisted. "They want you for some reason. If you're gone, maybe they'll just take what cattle they can and leave. And maybe they'll kill everyone looking for me," she countered. "Besides, I think I know what they're after." He turned to her, surprised. "What?" She hesitated, then reached into her jacket and withdrew a folded document. "This. My uncle gave it to me before I left, told me to keep it safe until we reached Helena." Jake took the paper, opening it carefully. It was a deed, transferring ownership of a significant property, the Diamond H Ranch, Hollister's main holding, to Joanna. "I don't understand," he said, looking up at her. "Your uncle is giving you his ranch." "He's dying," she said softly. "Consumption. The doctors give him 6 months." He wanted to make sure his affairs were in order. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. That's the real reason I insisted on coming. This drive, these cattle, they're to stock my ranch. My inheritance. Jake stared at her, pieces falling into place. Wilson must have found out somehow. This is worth far more than a few thousand cattle. She nodded grimly. With this deed and me out of the way, someone could claim the entire Diamond H. The magnitude of the situation struck Jake like a physical blow. This wasn't just about rustling anymore. It was about murder and theft on a grand scale. We need to be ready when they come, he said, his voice hardening with resolve. We will be, she answered, her eyes meeting his with unwavering determination. As they prepared for the coming fight, Elijah called for Jake. The old man was pale but alert, propped up against saddles in their makeshift camp. Sit, son, he said, patting the ground beside him. Jake sat, concern evident on his face. You should be resting. Plenty of time for rest in the grave, Elijah replied with a weak smile. But before this goes any further, there's something you should know. He paused, gathering strength. I knew your father well. Better than you might think. Jake frowned. You never mentioned that before. Wasn't sure it was my place. But now, Elijah coughed, wincing with pain. Your father was a proud man, Jake. Too proud sometimes. But he loved you fiercely. He had a strange way of showing it, Jake said, unable to keep the bitterness from his voice. He didn't know how, Elijah explained gently. His own father was a hard man, never gave an inch of praise. Caleb wanted to be different with you, but old habits. The old cowboy's eyes grew distant with memory. Last time I saw him, about a year before he passed, he couldn't stop talking about you. How you had a gift with horses, how you understood cattle better than men twice your age. Jake swallowed hard against a sudden tightness in his throat. He never told me that. That was his failing, not yours. Elijah reached out, clasping Jake's arm. Fifth lesson of the trail, and maybe the most important. Don't leave words of love unsaid. Tomorrow isn't promised to any man. Jake sat in silence, absorbing the old man's words. Finally, he asked, why tell me this now? Elijah's gaze drifted toward Joanna, who was checking rifles with Martinez nearby. Because I see how you look at her, and how she looks at you when you aren't watching. His weathered face creased into a knowing smile. Life's too short for hesitation, son. Before Jake could respond, Lal approached at a run. Riders coming, he reported tersely. At least a dozen, moving fast. The moment of reckoning had arrived. Jake positioned his men in a defensive circle around their small camp, with clear instructions to protect Joanna and Elijah at all costs. The approaching riders, Wilson, Hardy, and what appeared to be professional outlaws, slowed as they realized the element of surprise was lost. Cooper, Wilson called, halting his horse just out of rifle range. No need for bloodshed. Send out the girl and the deed, and we'll leave you be. You're a dead man, Wilson. Jake shouted back. You and Hardy both. Wilson laughed. There's 12 of us and 7 of you. Those aren't good odds, boss. Better than you think, came a voice from behind them. Wilson spun to find Lieutenant Phillips and 8 cavalry soldiers emerging from the trees, rifles ready. Caught between two forces, the rustlers hesitated, looking to their leader, a hard-faced man Jake didn't recognize. Last chance, Jake called. Surrender now or die where you stand. For a tense moment, it seemed the outlaws might risk a fight. Then, with a curse, their leader dropped his weapon. The others slowly followed suit. As the soldiers moved in to take the rustlers into custody, Jake felt a wave of relief wash over him. The danger had passed. They had lost cattle, certainly, but no lives, and they had exposed a conspiracy that reached all the way back to the Diamond H. The leader is Hollister's foreman, Lieutenant Phillips explained later, as they sat around a fresh campfire. Seems he and Wilson cooked up this scheme months ago. When they learned about Hollister's illness and his plans for the ranch, they decided to steal the deed and eliminate the heir. My uncle, Joanna asked anxiously, is he safe? We sent men to the ranch before riding out, Phillips assured her. He's under protection now, though from what I hear, he's more worried about you than himself. Jake watched as relief softened Joanna's features. In the firelight, with her golden hair loose around her shoulders, she looked both vulnerable and indomitable. Something stirred in his chest, a feeling he could no longer ignore. 2 days later, With the herd regrouped and the chuck wagon replaced thanks to supplies from Fort Keogh, they were ready to resume their journey to Helena. Elijah, though improving, was still too weak to ride. Lieutenant Phillips had arranged for him to travel with an army supply wagon heading in the same direction. Before departing, Elijah called Jake and Joanna to his side. "Been thinking about what happens when you reach Helena," he said, his voice stronger than it had been since his injury. "First, a hot bath," Joanna replied with a smile. Elijah chuckled. "After that, girl, the ranch. Running it won't be easy, especially alone." Joanna's smile faded. "I know, but I'll manage." "Never doubted it," the old man assured her. "But every ranch needs a good foreman. Someone who knows cattle, knows the land." His eyes shifted meaningfully to Jake. Jake felt heat rise in his face. "Mr. Thornton, sixth lesson of the trail," Elijah interrupted. "And my last for now. When the right path opens before you, take it without hesitation." With that, he settled back against his pillows, a satisfied expression on his weathered face. As they rode out that morning, Jake found himself alongside Joanna at the head of the column. For a while, they traveled in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Jake spoke. "I've been thinking about what happens in Helena." She glanced at him, her blue eyes curious. "Have you?" "I had plans," he continued, suddenly nervous. "The partnership with Hollister, working toward my own spread someday." "Good plans," she agreed, her expression carefully neutral. "But plans change," he said, gathering his courage. "Sometimes something better comes along, something you weren't looking for." Her horse drew closer to his, almost touching. "Something like what?" Jake took a deep breath. "Like meeting someone who makes you see possibilities you never imagined. Someone brave and stubborn and beautiful." A smile played at the corners of her lips. "Mr. Cooper, are you saying what I think you're saying?" "I'm saying I'd like to stay," he admitted, his heart pounding. "Help you with the ranch. If you'll have me." Her smile broadened, transforming her face with joy. "As my foreman?" "To start with," he replied, returning her smile. "The rest, well, that's up to you." She reached across the space between them, her hand finding his. "I think that can be arranged." As their fingers intertwined, Jake felt a certainty he had never known before. The trail ahead would not be easy. Running a ranch never was. But with Joanna beside him, he was ready to face whatever challenges came. Behind them, watching with satisfaction from the army wagon, Elijah Thornton nodded to himself. 95 years had taught him many things, but the most important was this. On the longest trail of all, life itself, finding the right traveling companion made all the difference. 6 months later, as winter's grip on Montana began to ease, Jake stood on the porch of the Diamond H Ranch house, watching the sunrise paint the snow-covered peaks in shades of gold and rose. The past half-year had been the most challenging and rewarding of his life. Old Man Hollister had passed peacefully just after Christmas, secure in the knowledge that his beloved ranch was in good hands. The rustlers, including Wilson and Hardy, had been sentenced to long terms in territorial prison. The cattle operation was thriving under Jake's management, and plans for spring calving were well underway. But the greatest joy in Jake's life was the woman who now stepped out onto the porch beside him, slipping her arm through his. "Beautiful morning," Joanna said, her breath visible in the crisp air. "Beautiful wife," he replied, drawing her closer. They had married in a simple ceremony 3 months earlier, with Elijah as Jake's best man. The old cowboy had recovered remarkably, though he walked with a more pronounced limp these days. He had taken up permanent residence in a comfortable cabin on the ranch property, where he spent his days telling stories to anyone who would listen and teaching Jake everything he knew about ranching. "Letter came yesterday," Joanna said, producing an envelope from her pocket. "From Elijah's granddaughter in California. She's coming to visit in the spring." Jake smiled. "He'll like that. Man should be surrounded by family." "Speaking of family," Joanna said, a mysterious smile playing on her lips, "I have some news." Jake turned to her, raising an eyebrow. "News?" She took his hand and placed it gently on her stomach. "Come September, there will be another Cooper at the Diamond H." For a moment, Jake stood frozen, his mind processing her words. Then a grin spread across his face, and he lifted her off her feet in a joyful embrace. "A baby," he whispered against her hair. "Our baby. Our baby," she confirmed, laughing as he set her down gently. Elijah says he's determined to live long enough to teach another generation his trail lessons. I wouldn't bet against him, Jake said, his heart fuller than he had ever thought possible. Later that day, they rode together to Elijah's cabin, finding the old man whittling on the porch despite the cold. His face lit up at their news, and for a moment, Jake thought he saw tears in the weathered cowboy's eyes. Seventh lesson, Elijah said after congratulating them, his voice rough with emotion. The greatest legacy any of us leaves isn't cattle or land or money. It's love, passed down like a torch from one generation to the next. As the three of them sat together, planning and dreaming of the future, Jake reflected on the journey that had brought him here. A cattle drive that had become so much more, a path to love, to family, to belonging. All because a young cowboy had been willing to learn life lessons from a 95-year-old cattle drive veteran.